Um, I thought that before I get into it, I would share just a bit of context to set the stage for what we're going to talk about. So, I have a consulting practice, and I started out in the private sector. And about maybe 7 years ago, I moved more firmly into public sector consulting and education. And a lot of times, my projects started with a potential client saying, well, Lincoln, we need you to help us become data driven. We know that data driven decision making is the thing to do, and we want to do it. So help us become data driven. And the next kind of logical step proceeded from helping them understand, well, what that meant for their organization. And then also, more to the point, what were going to be the actions, what were going to be the things that I would need to do to really help them get there. And my work with education started around the time of the No Child Left Behind Act, at which point there was a lot of concern, and concern that exists to this day, around standardized testing. And so what I found is that it became very important to help my clients get comfortable with understanding their own data. And so the focus became, okay, how do we start with the data we already have? And how we start not just collecting it for someone else to judge us by, but how do we, actually learn from the information that we collect? So that became the first motivation. The other observation I had in transitioning from the private sector to the public sector is that, multiple stakeholders get involved in conversations around education. So in the group that I work with on culture and climate, we have a collection of students, parents, teachers, board members, faculty, and they all come with different perspectives. There's multiple stakeholders at the table, but together we have to come up with policies that make sense. And even if you go beyond education, there are implications involving students and their families that involve the communities they live in, things such as public safety and public health. And so ultimately, good policy requires, in a lot of cases, multiple stakeholders being in the room, bringing their different perspectives, and coming up with something that's mutually beneficial. So taking all those concerns and kind of reflecting back over a number of different projects, I ended up reaching out to a good friend and a colleague, Dr. Bill Massey at Princeton University. And he's an academic, but he also had a 20-year career in Bell Labs. And so he knows quite a bit about the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. And he also has fostered a community of African-American researchers that span a lot of different skill sets. And a common question that comes up is, how do we get different people with different skill sets to work together? So with him and I working in collaboration, we came up with a framework called CODAP. And what I want to do this evening is very briefly introduce you to the CODAP idea, and then spend some more time talking about how we've used this framework for data-driven decision-making to drive some really interesting racial equity work within a high school. So in the spirit of working with multiple stakeholders, one of the issues with being data-driven is that we all have different definitions in our head of what data means. And sometimes we fail to acknowledge that. So to start us off, I would like to just say, this is going to be our working definition from data. So I'm going to say data a lot of times, but when I say it, this is what I mean. Data is what we observe and record. Now, a lot of times we think about that as numbers. It doesn't have to be numbers. It could be photographs, it could be interviews, it could be pictures, it could be anything. It could be very broad, but for now, let's just say we're going to use the definition that data is what we observe and record. Okay, so we've got a definition for data. Now we need to drive that data into decisions. So we get help here from a concept called DIKW. DIKW was a framework developed or put forth about 30 years ago as a way of organizing information or organizing knowledge. The notion of concepts such as data, information, knowledge, and wisdom have been around for hundreds of years, but this was one of the most formal kind of statements of how these things relate to each other. And just to give a demonstration of how these ideas relate, It's commonly depicted as a pyramid, and you start with individual observations. So in a healthcare context, you might look at things like activity level, heart rate, blood pressure as data points. And then the idea is that you could take that data and cultivate from that data information by assigning values. So this person's sodium intake is high, this person's blood pressure is high, there's a high heart rate. And then from there, you could cultivate that information up to knowledge. And at this point, we're defining relationships between our different pieces of data. Sodium intake is related to blood pressure. High blood pressure leads to cardiovascular disease. And then the next step up would be to take that knowledge and then cultivate wisdom from that. Some sort of sense of, given what we know, if we reduce sodium intake in food, it'll lower our blood pressure and then reduce cardiovascular disease risk. So this is a way that this DIKW, data, information, knowledge, wisdom paradigm has been implemented in just managing data systems. But we want data-driven decision making. And having wisdom isn't enough to arrive at a decision. So when Bill put this to me, he said, well, what's the next step beyond wisdom? Well, once we have the wisdom, we have to actually take action. And he called that action step agency. So agency becomes the call to action that connects data to the decisions we make. So again, starting with the concept of data, we move to information, then to wisdom, to knowledge rather, then to wisdom, and then to agency. And then once we take agency, we can now arrive at a decision. Now, one of the things that we observed about this is that once you make a decision, you have new things that you can observe and report, or new data. And so what we're talking about isn't so much a pyramid, but more of a cycle that takes us from data through all of these different steps: the data stage, information stage, knowledge stage, wisdom stage, agency stage. And then if we do those things, as we pass through those 5 states, we claim that we can then come to a decision. But then we start to run into a different issue. Data, again, we defined it for the sake of argument here, but it's a concept. And as I've worked with different folks in different contexts, these concepts mean different things to different people. You can very easily get into a debate about, well, where does data begin and information end? What's the difference? What's the dividing line? And so rather than get into that philosophical discussion, we took a step back and said, okay, what actions are we taking? What is the work that we're doing in this process? And by thinking about the work, we move from these concepts to actual actions. So the corresponding actions we describe as we're collecting, we're organizing, we're describing, we're analyzing, and then we're prescribing. CODAP, CODAP. So in this context, CODAP represents the actions that connect us in making this data-driven decision making. And as we thought about it in this context, it aligned to asking a series of logical questions. So one way you could think about it is that when you're collecting data, you're ultimately addressing the question, what is happening? That's your initial observation. And then once that data is organized, you can then report out what was happening. And as you begin to describe relationships, you're creating models, and those models help you understand what does happen or what happens in general. Given those models, you analyze the model to put forth and speculate on what might happen. And then armed with an understanding of all the things that might happen, you can then prescribe. And that gives you guidance on what should happen. And once you take that step, we claim that you now have the information you need to make a decision. And once that decision is made, the cycle can begin anew. So to show a very kind of simple example of how this idea plays out, imagine you had a delivery truck driver, and This person has a bunch of packages, and they have to park their truck and deliver their packages one at a time. And the decision that they're trying to make is where to park. So in a very simple case, this is what the CODAP framework would look like. First stage, collect. Well, you're going to collect a bunch of different delivery details for your parcels. So you've got a bunch of boxes, and there's a bunch of different attributes. Tracking number, package weight, the name of the customer, the street address. Okay, and then that next step becomes organized. Okay, now these things can be sorted by any one of these attributes, but for the delivery truck driver, what matters is the street address. And you could model that as points on a line, right? So now that we've organized these parcels in a way that's meaningful for the delivery truck driver, we have to describe the process. So like we said, the driver is going to, if I can get this button to work, yes. So the driver is going to park his car, and we're going to make where the driver parks this yellow dot, and they're going to go to one address and go back to the truck. Second address, back to the truck, and so on and so forth. So this is the delivery process. And, you know, if we want to describe it in math terms, very simply, it's going forward and back. So it's the absolute distance between each of the different locations in the truck, and you're going to double that. And the total distance is going to be the sum across all the items. So that's our describe step. So next we analyze. And in this case, we're analyzing all the different options for parking. So where the person wants to put the truck, they can put it anywhere on the street. And basically, it's pretty quickly you can start to see, well, if I'm parking all the way out here, I'm making it harder on myself because I have a farther distance to walk. But as I move in, I'm getting closer to my other addresses as I move further away. So this is the analysis step. And then comes the prescription step. Where's the best place to park? Well, it would be in the median. In this case, the middle address. If there were 6 houses, it would be somewhere in between the middle 2 addresses. And again, this is a very kind of simple example, but it shows that in the decision-making process, how you move from collecting to then organizing to describing to analyzing and prescribing. So again, you've got your actions, which are the steps of CODAP, and in this case, a number of different results. So to shift gears a bit, with this CODAP methodology, I want to talk a bit about how I've been able to use this in working with the school district on a racial equity issue, specifically the issue of student discipline. So in this case, we're taking the same 5 actions, but we have different results. So we're collecting, but this time we're collecting records that are relevant to school discipline. In our organization step, we're going to be producing different sorts of summary reports, charts and tables, highlighting race and other factors. In our description step, that's going to be our models of existing processes. So we're going to look at the processes and procedures related to discipline. In our analyze step, we're going to look at the predicted impacts of changes to procedures. And then ultimately in the prescribe step, we need to come up with an updated school policy and or procedures based on what we now learn. Now, this is work in progress. And for the sake of tonight's discussion, I'm really going to just focus on the first 3 parts. And although in the delivery truck example, it was pretty easy to just move along the steps, but you'll find that in practice, it's better to think of this as different stages, because you may arrive at one stage, but then have to go back and collect more data. And that's what we had to do in our example. So this is where we started with the high school. Infractions by race. When I started working with the district, they saw that in this particular community, that the Black students attending this school accounted for more than half of the infractions. And this was a trend that the school had seen semester upon semester, and the district would report, and every report, they saw the same information, and this was the cause for frustration. And in a sense, when you think about this, this is the way that most of us encounter data for the first time. It's usually as a chart and a table. There's data that's been collected, and this data that's been organized. So we start there and we begin to say, okay, let's look at what we've collected. So in a first step, we obviously have our discipline records, but we said, let's add something else to get a bit more context. And that something else was information about student enrollment. Because what we wanted to do was take those data numbers and put them in some sort of context relative to the student body. And so I shared with the school board a chart that looked something like this. So now we have two sets of bars, and the gray bars, the top level, represent the actual breakdown of student enrollment. And those bottom bars are what you saw before, the percentage of infractions, but now it's been placed in a context of the student body. And what showing the data in this way did immediately was point out what was that when you looked at outcomes for white students, they seem to account for far fewer, for a much lower percentage of the infractions, and black students accounted for a much higher percentage of the fractions versus their enrollment. Whereas for other racial groups, the numbers seemed closer on par. And this resonated with a lot of longstanding community concerns where they felt that black students were, just for some reason, way more likely to get in trouble disproportionately. So it turned out that this is where this disproportionality was happening, and it took collecting that additional set of data to get that bit of context. So from there, we decided to, let's see, and if I can get this to advance. Yes. We organized the data another way. And we said, well, let's understand what type of infractions we're seeing here. And what became interesting is that the majority of the infractions in this particular school district were actually related to attendance and detention issues. So there wasn't a lot of, fighting or behavioral infractions, but it was primarily being late to class and missing detention. And the most common infraction was called failure to serve detention. So the idea here was that if you were assigned a detention for missing too many classes and you waited too long to serve detention, you would get another penalty on top of that. So now knowing that the bulk of the issues are related to detentions and attendance, we said, okay, how do tardies become code infractions? And so this was the policy. Once the class has begun, late students are required to go and get a tardy pass. And if you get more than 5 tardies in a semester, they had 48 hours to schedule or to either schedule or serve their detention. And then once they went outside that guideline, you would then get an additional. And ultimately that was the issue. And so since tardies were the primary cause of the infractions, we shifted our focus to tardies. So now we're back on the collection step. So we've got discipline records and we've got student enrollment, but now we're going to actually add information about student tardies. Now we get the student ID, but we also get new information. We get the time tardies occur, we get the date of the tardy, and then we also get how many tardies the student has accumulated over time. And this time and day information ends up being very interesting because ultimately we're not only trying to understand tardies, but we're trying to understand what to do about them and how to intervene. So now we're doing an organized step. We say we're going to organize the enrollment and the tardies by race. And again, we see this disparity in white student outcomes and black student outcomes. The same thing we saw before, but this time we're looking at enrollment versus students with 5 or more tardies. And again, the 5 or more number is significant because once you get more than 5 tardies, that's when it becomes a disciplinary issue. We also learned something else with this new information, that in this district, in this semester, 2/3 of the tardies occurred at first period. And as a person who routinely got to school late when I was in high school, I can attest that, this was mostly the case. And in the school, late to school tardies were used to refer to this first period, and late to class was the way they characterized all the tardies that happened after first period. And from an intervention standpoint, it makes sense that there might be different things going on here. So if I'm late to campus, that could be an access to transportation issue. That could be a weather issue, particularly in the wintertime. And it could be a commute time issue if I live too far away. Once I'm on campus and I'm late, those are different factors. Off campus lunch, I might be late coming back. I might have classrooms that are really far apart from each other, or I might have a class like, gym class or work study, and that might be causing the issue. So the idea is that even though there was one shared policy, the driving factors and therefore the interventions needed to curb the behaviors may be completely different because there were different root causes. So now we're back to looking at this data and we say, okay, we look at the students and we were actually able to break the data down, and we found that there were a certain group of students who only accumulated tardies at the beginning of the day. So they had a lot of tardies, but they were only late for that first period. And after first period, there were no issues. And there was a smaller group, but there was also a distinct set of kids who had no problems getting to that first class on time, but they accrued all of their tardies after first period. So now using these subgroups, we decided to go back and look at that tardy distribution information again. And this is what we found. When we looked at the kids who were only late, marked late at the beginning of the day, something really interesting happened. We saw that the distribution of tardies was very similar to the distribution of the student body. So that racial disparity that we had been seeing all along disappeared strictly for that group of students who accumulated all of their tardies at the beginning of the day. But when we built back to the late to class students, the ones that were getting all their tardies in from second period to eighth, the disparity was there again. So this became curious, and it required us to go back to that describe step. How can time of day be impacting the process? So even though there's one policy, it's implemented in different ways depending on time of day. So when a kid is late at the beginning of school, it's a centralized process through the attendance office. There's a single set of doors that most students enter toward, and they are immediately routed to an attendance office located near the main entrance, and they all get their tardy pass. After first period, it's a decentralized process, and it's managed by faculty and staff. And the late students are either already on campus, or if they're at lunch, they can re-enter from multiple doors. And students can go to one of several check-in stations to receive a tardy pass. And so even though it's the same policy, it's implemented in different ways depending on the time of day. So to date, we've been able to learn a lot of different things through applying this process. So we have that the infraction counts are racially disproportionate with respect to enrollment, specifically for Black and white students. We see that the lion's share of infractions are actually due to missed detentions. We also saw that there was a distinct group of kids, of students who only accrue tardies at first period, and a smaller group, but still distinct group of kids who only accrued their tardies after first period. Meaning that even though they are both issues that need to be addressed, it might be different root causes and different types of interventions depending on the type of child. And we also found, which was surprising, that the late to school students, the ones that were getting all their tardies at the beginning of the day, were racially proportional with respect to enrollment and racially disproportional. So what does that all mean? As we're moving forward, we're moving into the analyze step and to really get an understanding of, now that we understand what's happening with the current policy, what might be happening if we decide to change the policy in different ways. So in terms of what's happening on campus, we're looking at things like lunch periods and gym classes and the long distances between classes, because it's a big campus, as all being potential factors in what's happening on campus. And anecdotally, there's evidence to suggest that ultimately some teachers enforce the policy and some teachers don't. And one of the things that we know about the school is that despite the racially diverse campus, there's not as much diversity within classrooms. So the working hypothesis, and we'll need to do more work to bear this out, is that the teachers of the advanced classes are more likely to not enforce the policy, which ultimately would disproportionately benefit the white students. So this is all work that's in progress, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what we're learning. But I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. And thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to enter into the Q&A section. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and use that raise hand option that's listed in the participants area if you have a question. If you can't find that, you can feel free to go ahead and type your question in the chat section. All right, Eliza, you can go ahead and ask your question. Eliza Cooper Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chandler. I'm very curious about the reaction of the school district after your presentation. It's tremendously meaningful. So I'm curious about the analysis and their decision to change something about their policy. If it was, thank you.
Sure. No, thank you for the question. I think it was. I think generally it depends on who you ask, right? So again, there's multiple stakeholders. I think that the board was pretty surprised by the findings, but not, because for them it validated what they were hearing from concerned community members, but they had just never seen it in that context. I think the thing that was maybe most surprising as a community level was the notion that differences in how the policy was being enforced would have racial implications. Because we had teachers who basically said, well, of course I make sure kids get a tardy pass before they come to my classroom, because they felt there was a discipline component, and that was the way they were managing their classroom. But you also had other teachers who were just as passionate, saying, well, heck, I'm late sometimes. So why would I, give my student grief and make them go in and out of the classroom? So it turned out that different philosophies that teachers had was resulting in different classroom management styles, but it was rolling up to what became a racial inequity. So I think that part of it was a bit surprising, that what was happening on the fourth floor could impact what was happening on the third floor, so to speak. So, but there has been definitely a desire to change. But now the question is, what would be a better policy that we could all agree with and implement with fidelity? So that's the question now. Thank you.
Okay, Ara Lewis, it looks like you have a question.
Yes, good evening. Was there a relationship between the grades students received and their tardiness or the suspensions? So thinking if a student is late to class, then those are the, quote unquote bad students, if you will. And maybe good students were getting a pass when they were running late.
Right. So so for this particular cohort, that analysis has not been done. But at the macro level, the notion does seem to be that if indeed the honors level courses have lower enforcement of the policy, there's definitely higher grade point averages amongst kids taking the honors classes. And so there's a correlation there, but it's not clear how it breaks down within a classroom. So that's TBD.
All right, I have a question from the chat from Sarah Van Etten Thomas. What are ways you could see using the CODAP process with students in high school classrooms?
Well, I mean, I should ask you all. It's what's interesting about it is that as a framework, I've found it to be pretty durable. But one way it seems to have worked out, at least in my practice, is that again, ultimately, the first time we tend to see data, it tends to already be in a chart. And so I think it can help in at least just kind of thinking through, okay, so why is the data organized in this way? So you can ask two questions off top. You can say, well, how is this data collected? Which tends to have implications for what you get. And then you could say, well, we organized it this way. How could we organize it in other ways? And so in the example with the delivery truck driver, if I'm a delivery truck driver, I probably am going to order my data by street address because I need to deliver the packages. But if I were the company itself, I might want to order it by frequency of shipment, or by package weight, or by order it was received. So the idea is it hopefully could get you to just thinking differently about all the different decisions that go into working with data, but it also, I believe, gives you an opportunity to be at least comprehensive in thinking through all the different things that need to happen before you make a decision.
Okay, I have another question from Shanae McNair. It looks like you have a question.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you for that presentation of information. I guess my question is, you talk about the infractions in terms of tardies. Like, were there any other infractions that kind of stood out other than tardies, especially in regards to like race within that school?
Sure. Yes. So if we were to, so when we looked at suspensions, actually, I mean, to be honest, across the board, you saw the disproportionality. So if Black students accounted for the 50% of the infractions, they kind of accounted for those infractions across the board. But what was interesting about focusing in on the tardy piece is, one, it was the biggest single bucket to look at. And then also what became interesting about it is that it allowed us to really understand how the policy might be contributing to what we were seeing. Because ultimately, what's interesting about this particular district is that infractions, there aren't a lot of, I mean, you get to a point where you don't have a ton of infractions. And actually in Illinois, legislation was passed very soon after this work began that made it much more difficult for there to be expulsions and suspensions. And so the numbers of other types of infractions went down even further. So when you're working with very small numbers of data, it gets harder to get statistical significance around some of these things. And so we started at the biggest bucket first to just see what we could understand more broadly about the policy. But that's a very long answer to your question, but that disproportionality persisted throughout different levels of infraction. Thanks for the question.
Okay, I have a question from the chat from Levon Hunter. She's asking if you're able to share what district this data is from.
I would rather not at this point, but it's a big suburban district. So.
All right, and another question from the chat from Jamie Kubiak asks, how might we introduce this framework for data analysis to our individual schools and school leadership?
Well, there is, stay tuned, but there is a work in progress. And so Bill and I are actually working on putting together sort of a public framework that would be shareable in that context. So.
All right, I'm seeing another question from Cindy. Looks like you have a question.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Chandler. As you broke down the students according to race, I was wondering if there was a similar breakdown for staff members by race as well, the ones who were recording the tardies, and also by years of experience or by years of experience.
That's an outstanding question. We haven't gotten there yet, but a lot of times I talk about the equity work that I've been doing as sort of like a three-legged stool. So I was introduced to this work by looking at equity with respect to student achievement. And in this more recent kind of chapter, it's been a lot of focus on student behavior, but I think where the rubber meets the road is really understanding teacher practice. And historically, that was kind of the third rail. It became one of the more controversial things to talk about. But what I can say is that it has opened up the possibility of beginning to talk about that. I mean, to be frank, one of the challenges is that that data wasn't always that well kept. And so if I asked for, say, referral data, so how do we even find out who's flagging children and recommending them well, some of that information resides here, some of that information resides there. And so part of the guidance for this particular client has been the importance of having that information and developing better discipline around recording all of those things so we can actually tell that story with some fidelity. But without doubt, it does seem that that's part of the question. But our hindrance at this point is lack of good, clear data to be able to see it. So thank you for the question, though.
Okay, another question from the chat from Justin. How do you facilitate schools in the analyze phase? Oftentimes it seems that assumption/prior experiences drive the analysis more than an objective lens.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that's helped this particular district is that not too long after we started doing this work, we started convening the multi kind of sector group that I referred to earlier. And it's not a perfect process because there is a culture of a lot of unilateral decision making. But what we've been able to do over time is establish a norm where with all of our policies, there's kind of step one is kind of figuring out, what are we currently doing? And then step two becomes what should we be doing differently? And what we should be doing differently is what that analyze piece is about. So the only way that seems to work is by establishing up front that we really need to have a group of folks looking at this information together. And before we change the policy, look at it and really try to understand from multiple perspectives what are the consequences of changing things. So just a quick example, what the district did immediately after this analysis is that they said, well, instead of 5 tardies being the magic number before it becomes disciplinary, let's raise it to 10. So that's what they did. They changed the policy. But what I can tell you is that didn't do anything to get at the root cause of the issue. It delayed the shift to consequences, but it did not get at the root issue, which was that we have a policy that some teachers were using and some teachers weren't using. And it doesn't matter what the policy is. If half of the people are using it and the other half aren't, you're not going to get the results that you seek. And so we've kind of had to learn the hard way that just changing stuff for the sake of changing it isn't going to get us to better results. But what is going to get us to better results is having kind of this clear multi-stakeholder conversation around what we could be doing differently.
Okay, it looks like I have about 2 more questions in the chat. And if anyone else has any more that they'd like to input, please feel free. George asks, it seems like the tardy detention system was sort of set up to snowball on a student. Was there any discussion of the morality of that?
No. I think what I can say about it is that tardy system is an automated system that was put in place. And what you could say is that the snowballing was, my perception is that the snowballing effect was an unintended consequence. When you talk to people who've been in the high school long enough, they'll say that before we got this automated system, tardies were through the roof. And the nice thing about the system is now we've got this computer that just checks off, how many times a person's tardy, and it's a set it and forget it. But ultimately, it does have this snowballing effect. And I think, again, I think it was an unintended consequence. But unfortunately, when you're talking about equity, there's a lot of unintended consequences. And what we hope to do with this more kind of intentional approach is to prevent unintended consequences. So.
All right. Irene asks, is there a possibility that data can be manipulated somewhere along the process to get favorable results?
Always. Yeah, but again, I think that's why we. So how do you mitigate that? Well, one is being inclusive about the decision making process. Where does the data come from? How are we collecting data? There are all sorts of places to kind of lean on the scales, so to speak. But the way we strive to mitigate it in this new work is, one, being inclusive about how we're doing the work. So again, we've got students, we've got teachers, we've got parents, we've got community, and we've got skeptics, we've got pro, we got con. So part of it is having everyone in the room at the same time and agreeing to the process. And then even within that process, there's a lot of work that we've been doing, a lot of things that we've borrowed from restorative practice to build trust within that community. And again, these are things that don't happen overnight, but we've been at it going on 5 years now, and there has been a sea change in the way the district operates. So.
Okay, I think I have about 2 questions that open, then we can wrap it up. Amos asks, was there a discussion of matching the goal of a tardy detention system with the punishment? Do the punishments result in fewer tardies?
Prior to this work, no. I think that was a concern. I mean, the idea was that, an overarching concern is, what correlation, what evidence is there at all that, these consequences or punishments, or whatever you want to call them, curb behavior. And one evidence for that is that we treat all tardies the same. And I don't think my high school is the only one that does this, but a tardy is a tardy. And clearly, I can't wake up in time to make it to school is a different issue than I decide to hang out for lunch, or I have an issue with this teacher 7th period, so I'm just not going to be there. So if we want to really get serious about curbing the behavior, we have to move from just reacting to the lateness to understanding root cause. Why is this student late? And thinking through interventions that are going to address that particular issue. And now we're on a path to do that.
Okay, I think that may be it for this evening. Thank you, Dr. Chandler. This was fantastic. I'm glad we had such a good group. We had over 150 people in the room.
Oh, thank you all. This was amazing. I really appreciate it. I really do.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for spending your Thursday with us. It was so great to see everyone's faces virtually. Have a nice evening.
This is very cool. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening, folks. Be safe.